Hello everybody, welcome back to Principles in Curriculum Design. My name is Alex Ford. I'm a Schools History Project Fellow and a PGCE tutor at Leeds Trinity University. As I spoke to you last time, hopefully you've watched the previous video. This is a series of online sessions looking at curriculum and the big issues around curriculum at the moment, and we will go through what exactly we're going to cover as we go on to the next slide. But just to say that there is a whole range of materials that go with this session, which you will be able to find in the link down at the bottom there. Now, last session we looked at why curriculum, why everybody's talking about curriculum so much at the moment. In this session, what I want to do is go on and think about what is curriculum? What have people said about curriculum? What's the theory around curriculum? And you might think that's a kind of superfluous thing to do. You know, why do we need to know about the history of it and what people have written about it? But actually, it shapes so much of what people are now discussing that it gives you a tool set to be able to engage meaningfully with those discussions about curriculum. It also enables you to be critically aware of the way in which people are using that term curriculum now. So you can say, actually, there are other ways of thinking about curriculum than the ones in which people are throwing around in lots of the popular stuff on curriculum that you will see online through Ofsted and various other places. So what is curriculum today? And hopefully we'll find this helpful, particularly for new teachers going in, starting to get into these discussions, maybe in departments. It will enable you to contribute to those as well. So in looking at that question, what is curriculum? One of the things that has become apparent quite quickly is trying to do that in a single session is obviously too much. So I've split this into, as I said before, I'm going to split this into two sections. The first is looking at what is a curriculum in terms of the traditional idea of curriculum. And then the second part will be thinking about a progressive curriculum. And then there's another part after that where we'll think about maybe what's a way of going beyond those two ways of thinking about curriculum. And I think we need to think broadly about what we mean by curriculum. What is a curriculum? Because the danger, as we talked about in the previous session, when the Ofsted research happened in 2017, what they found was a lot of people equated curriculum and timetable as being the same thing. So your curriculum was what was on the timetable, or it might have been the list of things that you needed to cover, which is more a specification. So, and of course, it doesn't really help, just to take a little aside here, that the national curriculum is deeply unhelpful as a model for curriculum, being neither national, because not everybody has to follow it, nor a curriculum because it doesn't tell you what order you have to cover it in. So there's a whole range of issues around here, I think. What is curriculum then? So we could think broadly about what curriculum is. This lovely phrase came from Will Bailey Watson, who teaches at the University of Reading. He talks about curriculum being opportunity, which I really love. I also really like the idea that it's about identity. Our curriculum is about the identity of our school, it's about the identity of our department, maybe it's the identity of a wider group of schools as well. It is about identity, it's about our identity, it's also about the identities of the students that we teach, and I think we need to bear both of those in mind. Now that's quite amorphous, so I don't want to get too sidetracked into this at the moment, but we had, I was talking to Rob Pepper, who is an assistant head at Rydell School, and they talk very much about the way at Rydell they thought very carefully about their context and what the right curriculum was for their students, that gave them opportunities but also reflected the unique character of the area. So I think there's lots in there that we could unpick and think about. The short answer is that there's no short answer to curriculum. So what is curriculum? Well, it isn't simple. Curriculum is really a series of answers to questions that we have, and we can ultimately answer them in lots of different ways depending on the aims that we have for our curriculum. And this is the big thing that often gets overlooked when we talk about curriculum. We can't easily say this is what curriculum is because it's debated, and it's still debated. It's not that these debates happened in history and then have gone. It's still a hotly debated issue about what we are trying to achieve with curriculum. And depending on where you are in the world as well, more hotly debated than other places, there's a huge amount of issues in how you construct curriculum, particularly when we're looking at post-colonialism, what happens, when colonial powers leave, what should curriculum be in those instances. Curriculum, ultimately, whether we like it or not, and whether we want to get engaged in that complexity or not, it impacts on everything that we do. And therefore, just being aware of the way in which we're conceiving of curriculum will help us become better teachers, because we will know what we're trying to achieve with curriculum, or rather we might understand better why our way of doing things is conflicting so much with the way that a school wants us to do things, or maybe an authority or a multi-academy trust wants us to do things, or the way that Ofsted wants us to do things, or claims it doesn't want us to do things. But anyway, we'll get back to that in a minute. Now, one really helpful way of framing this, I think, comes from this set of questions from Tyler, 1949. And they are, yeah, clearly very old set of questions, but actually they have enormous relevance to us today still, because they help shape thinking around what we're trying to talk about when we're talking about curriculum. So a curriculum involves all of these issues, really. First of all, question number one about curriculum: what purposes, what educational purposes should a school seek? What's it trying to do? What's the purpose of its curriculum? What does it want as the outcome at the end? What are the aims? And you'll know, and you'll start to hear, there's some connections between that question and the idea of intent in the Ofsted curriculum stuff as well. Secondly, what educational experiences will achieve those aims? So what should we teach people? If we want to do these things in question one, what should we therefore teach people in order to ensure that we do that? Thirdly, how will we organise those experiences? And the organisation in this could be physically on the timetable, but it could equally be in the classroom. What can we do to organise these experiences? It could be about sequencing, could be about order, could be about actually the practicalities of teaching the lessons as well. So the methods, there's more pedagogy. And then finally, how can we determine whether or not these things have been achieved? And that's to do with assessment. And you can see actually that these things are all really clearly connected to each other. But if we think about what's happened in schools for a long time actually now, we've been very focused on assessment for good reason. And, you know, the assessment, I'd never want to say assessment's not important, it is important, but we've been very focused on GCSE assessment, for example, in secondary. And therefore assessment has almost driven things the other way around. So if we want to achieve good results in these assessments, how should we teach? What content do we therefore need to cover? And that will tell us what our aims are. We could also have a look at curriculum in terms of what kinds of things have been promoted over time. So we could say we've got, you know, I love a Cartesian plane as much as the next person. We could talk about various curriculum models emphasising different elements. So either curriculum models that emphasise teacher authority or pupil autonomy. And we could talk about curriculum models that have a very fixed idea of what knowledge we should cover and really strong boundaries between subjects, so that each subject, you know, history is history and geography is geography and science is science, or chemistry is chemistry. And those that have much weaker dispositions. So it's not history and geography and RE, it's humanities. And I know the RE people balk at that already. And weaker kind of sets of knowledge. It's not really knowledge that's important, it's the skills we develop. So there's kind of 4 dimensions here we could look at different curriculum models on. And if we take different models of curriculum we've had, we can see how they fit into those. So the national curriculum, for example, was very, of 1991 especially, was very, very focused on setting out the knowledge that students should have. It was very clear about the boundaries between those subjects. This is history, this is geography, this is art. And it was quite clear. And lots of it was framed towards teachers delivering that content. So it was quite teacher authority focused. It was quite focused on fixed knowledge. If we look at the National Curriculum 2008, which is probably the most liberal version of the National Curriculum we ended up with, it shifts the focus much, much more. And it shifts the focus in several ways. First of all, it talked about breaking down traditional subject boundaries a lot more. And if we think about the history version of this, it took out almost all the specified content. So the only thing that's actually specified as a specific event was the Holocaust. And everything else was kind of, as long as you are teaching about empires, as long as you are teaching about big changes over time, those things. So it was still specifying it in some ways. It wasn't completely over here, but it also suggested there was work to be done that was cross-curricular, skills-based. Equally, it pushed much more onto the idea that students and pupils should have a lot of autonomy in building their work and coming up with their own answers and their own ideas, and therefore less focused on teacher authority. So the curriculum, the national curriculum itself, has shifted a lot over time, and we can see that in here. Really interestingly, Ofsted's interpretation of the 2008 curriculum was actually very different to the curriculum itself. So we've got 2 things going on here: the intended curriculum and then how the curriculum is received and understood by different groups, either pupils or in this case the inspectorate. So in 2008, when Ofsted were inspecting, lots of what they talked around was the autonomy pupils had to come up with their own views of the past, for example, in history, write their own things, teacher is the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage, and all those kinds of things that came up really frequently in that era. Less teacher talk, more pupil work. So we had an inspector that interpreted that, and interpreted it in a way that I think was probably more extreme towards pupil autonomy than the curriculum actually suggested it was. With that basic set of curriculum questions established, it's fair to say, I think, that one of the big stories of curriculum is that there is an enormous amount of competition about what we're trying to achieve with curriculum in the first place. Therefore, what I want to go on to now is thinking about probably what we would term the traditional model of curriculum. And that is what I'm going to hopefully outline for you now. So in both of these examples, both the traditional and then later the progressive curriculum, I'm going to be talking about them as extremes in curricular thinking, largely because the characterizations I'm going to give here are at the very extreme ends of that spectrum. So extreme one, the traditional curriculum, is very much a curriculum which is about transmitting bodies of knowledge. And I've just noticed my video's disappeared, so we'll see if I can get that back. So the traditional curriculum is also, it should be said, concerned with the ways in which we bring pupils up. So it's about establishing ways of being, so kind of resilience, that idea of leadership, preparing students, so preparing young people to be kind of self-sufficient and self-reliant and those kinds of things. That definitely is a thread in the traditional curriculum. But we are focusing on transmitting a body of knowledge to our pupils. And the idea is we are placing this knowledge from the older generation into the hands of a new generation of pupils. And as Matthew Arnold termed it, we are passing on the best of what has been thought and said. And actually it's really interesting because that phrase appears in the national curriculum, for example. It appears in the new Ofsted framework explicitly as that. So focusing on the transmission of a fixed body of knowledge is part of this curriculum. And if we think about what we're talking about when we're thinking about traditional education, it's not really a massive surprise. The traditional model of schooling was very much for elites, and the idea of schooling for elites was passing on a body of knowledge which enabled them to continue being elites and rulers. And obviously that was predominantly for males as well when we're going back to the origins of schooling, certainly in this country. So that idea that we're passing on that fixed body of knowledge came out of a very elite system of education, and it was transmitted over into the grammar school system, and particularly when we had a tripartite system in this country, and it was contrasted to the secondary modern approach to education, which was not necessarily about transmitting that body of fixed knowledge, but giving students a different sort of knowledge that would enable them to be active in the workplace after leaving school. So this is based on a really interesting notion, and I touched on Young and Muller earlier, and I'm going to touch upon them again briefly now. Michael Young and Johann Muller basically frame their idea around curriculum models as being how they see the future. And in this extreme, in the traditional curriculum extreme, the future is seen as being fundamentally similar to the present. So what we're doing is saying we're going to pass you on a body of knowledge because what the society in the future, the next generation of society, will predominantly be similar to the society that we have today. It will grow out of it, and it will be rooted in it, and therefore you need the knowledge of our current generation to move into the next generation. So that conception of what the future will be is really fundamental in this, according to Young Muller as well. Now, there are a couple of things that I would say that go with this as well. First of all, that idea that the body of knowledge that you pass on is kind of fixed, as in the knowledge itself is given. There is a set body of things that are considered to be the best of what's been thought or said, in Matthew Arnold's words. That might be that we study Shakespeare in literature, or we look at the roles of particular kings and queens, that we absolutely look at Henry II and Becket in history, for example, or that there are particular aspects of subjects that we must study because they are by their own right important. And you can see that very clearly And this grammar school exercise book on the right hand side from the 1930s from a girl called Irene Eaton, and it's very much based in this traditional model of here are some key people you must know about in this time period, which is the 17th century. So what have we got? We've got Charles II, we've got the Great Plague of 1665-6, the Great Fire of London, we've got Sir Christopher Wren, we've got John Milton, we've got Isaac Newton, and basically, and you can see the lovely title in the middle there, these are the great men that Irene Eaton's teachers decided she needs to know about. And when I say the teachers decided she needs to know about, I very much mean that, because if we read Irene Eaton's interview about her time in school, she very much characterises it as her teacher dictating things for her to put down, and then projects where she would go away and do things like this and illustrate those by finding either her own illustrations or finding, as you can see, a little cigarette card in here, which she's put in to provide some illustration for the knowledge she has been given that's been considered this is the key knowledge in history you need to have about the 17th century. So what's interesting about this is that knowledge therefore becomes, as I'm going to put on here, asocial, as in there's no sense in the fact that somebody has decided who these great men were at some point, or even that they've been termed to be great, and there's no debate around why they're considered great men, or even who considers them to be great men. They are just the great men of history. So that kind of asocialness of the knowledge is really embedded in a traditional curriculum. We learn these things because we've always learned them. We learn these things because we deem them to be important. Who deems them to be important? The people with the power to deem them important. And that might be the government, and it might be schools, it might be teachers, but they are determined somewhere else. It's not for the pupil to decide whether these things are important. They are told they're important. And so if you have that model of curriculum, it has some really interesting effects. Number one, the focus, therefore, if your aim is passing on a body of knowledge, and part of that aim, and it's right at the bottom here, is about educating you in a kind of broad sense of the liberal education, but also it's about passing on culture and civilization. If that is your aim, then the question about how do we get that across becomes, well, actually, if all you need to do is be told this stuff and remember it, your structure and your sequence of that knowledge is the most important thing. So how can we pass that on to you in the best possible way? Well, the answer to that might be, well, we do it through input and recall. So teacher input, student recall. So a very, very simple pedagogy, because you don't need to engage particularly with the veracity of that knowledge, or even any more deeply with that knowledge. You just need to know it for cultural preservation. And we hear that coming up again today, I think, in ideas of cultural capital, which is just a way of dressing up this idea of passing on things that we hold to be important to pupils. Secondly, it's about how we structure things in school. So the idea that if you want to pass on the best of what has been thought and said, you need a box in which to put those best of what has been thought and said things, and the boxes in which you put them are subjects like history, like geography, like English literature, like religious studies or divinity, or whatever else you want to call it. So the idea is that you say, well, where is that repository of knowledge, and we go and find that, and then we decide what we are going to pass on. Now, this is problematic in lots of ways, which we'll get onto in a second. The first little problem I'm going to touch in on here is that idea that if you're passing on what's important in your culture, let's use the modern term for it, the cultural capital. Let's use that idea of we're passing on what's important in our civilization. Let's use that idea that we're passing on the best of what has been thought and said. The big question is, well, whose idea? And quite often the answer to that is a dominant group. And usually the dominant group, and the dominant group of a particular generation as well. So there's a problem straight away. Also, we've got an interesting thing that comes up here, which is, although Irene Eaton has dutifully recorded her great men down here, she's also decided to include, and I love this because I love it when children just subvert what schools try and do. I don't love it when I'm actually teaching, but I love the concept that children can and will subvert things. She's gone away and she's found her great woman instead. And I presume that goes outside what she was asked to do, because it doesn't fit with the rest of everything else she's got here. So even if we decide on a body of knowledge that is the most important for students to know, regardless of what they come knowing already, that is kind of discounts what they come knowing already, which is a really interesting way of thinking about it. You know, if we say these are the important things you must know, let's forget about what you know already, it really discounts a huge amount of student experience. But anyway, so you might be able to dictate what you're going to teach, but it doesn't dictate what students will learn. And that's a really interesting thing about this, because however we phrase something and however we put something across, students will come into contact with that and they will learn, you know, in their own way, and it will intersect with their own personal beliefs and ideas, as many of you will have discovered when you trained to teach, for example. Everybody comes to training to teach with their own ideas about how to teach, and therefore a lot of teacher training is actually your ideas about what your beliefs about teaching and your knowledge about teaching and your experiences of having been taught coming into contact with your teacher trainers, your mentors in schools, the pupils that you're then trying to teach, and then a long process of negotiation between all those ideas. This model says that doesn't matter because what we want to do is transmit knowledge, but in reality what happens is students negotiate it anyway, and we see that in this picture that's been added in. And this is just looking into Irene Eaton's exercise book from the first page. I think this is really interesting because it speaks to the kinds of things we're trying to pass on in this terms of powerful, important knowledge for them to absorb. So what does she learn as part of this overall transmission of knowledge? Well, these are the things effectively she's being dictated to write, knowing how the kind of basic function of this would have happened, and actually having read Irene Eaton's interview where she talks about how she was taught, it's a lot of chalk and talk and the teacher saying write this down, write this down. So what does she learn about King John? Well, she learns he was a bad king. She learns he had 3 quarrels with the King of France and with the Pope, over Stephen Langton in this case, and with the barons. There we go. So John, he had 3 quarrels. Here are three groups he quarrelled with. He was forced to seal the Magna Carta in 1215. That's cut off the end there. And these are the main clauses. The church shall be free. The king must only take the usual taxes. No freeman must be put in prison without trial. And foreign merchants are not to be taxed. And weights and measures. There we go. That's it. That's all she learns about John. So it's the kind of pub quiz. These are the key things John did. There's no depth. There's no why did it happen. There's no thinking about what was the significance of it. Was it really a new dawn for political history? No, she's learnt it because Magna Carta is the starting point of political history, and it's important that she's got that cultural inheritance. How much depth has she got here? Very, very little. I think it's fascinating the teacher thinks this is poor, but I presume that's a reference to handwriting. Now, if we go across the page, Marco Polo. Marco Polo was a great Genoese explorer. He reached Cathay and saw, I can't read that little bit there, saw Kublai Khan, wrote a book about his travels, which Columbus read in later years. That is her some learning on Marco Polo. So again, the theory here, the curriculum here is she needs to know that. She needs to know who Marco Polo is. She needs to know that he went and met Kublai Khan. And that's pretty much it. Edward I in Wales, again, same idea. He conquered Wales. He gave his son to be the first Prince of Wales. There's your cultural inheritance, the first Prince of Wales, Edward I. In Scotland, he failed in Scotland, but he was called the Hammer of the Scots. No thinking about why that was. No thinking about what occurred. Why did this happen? No thinking about how has Edward I been interpreted. Just these are his nicknames. Scottish heroes were William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. That's Scotland dealt with. And Edward II was defeated by Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314. It's just a list of things. And there's so, I mean, again, we could say there was more behind this, but again, having read the interview, there isn't anything more behind this. And then we get into other things. So there's a whole range of misconceptions that develop in this way of doing things. So already you can start to see some of the problems here. Whose knowledge are we passing on? How do we deal with the unproblematic nature of we're creating this idea that knowledge is somehow unproblematic and you just need to know it. So this one is amazing. If you'd like to do this as an exercise, it's good fun. Here's a little passage from Irene's exercise book about the end of the Middle Ages. And you might want to pause me here and just think, how many misconceptions can you find in here? How many misconceptions about the Middle Ages can you find in here that are really problematic in terms of historical understanding? So I'm just going to pause a second and I'm going to go through mine. Okay, so for me, big things here. The end of the Middle Ages, about 1500. Big problem number one, this kind of idea that the Middle Ages is a distinct period rather than something that we usefully used to characterize. That's a massive problem here. The Middle Ages somehow ended and then we jumped into, I don't know, the Renaissance or the early modern period or whatever they would have called it in Irene's school. That happened about 1500. So there's this kind of, again, this idea that the Middle Ages just kind of stops and another thing starts. That things helped to bring it about. Now, this is really interesting. The Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt helped to free the lines. There's a conflation of the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt here. And that idea that they're seen as a single event, even though they're a generation apart, actually. So there's no sense of how the two built on each other. Only that there's this kind of required knowledge that the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt ended the feudal system. We've got the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses killed many powerful barons. So again, we've got this kind of slightly bizarre notion developing in here. What is the Middle Ages? Well, the Middle Ages is an age where there are villeins. The Middle Ages is an age when there are barons, and now they're gone. And the Middle Ages is an age where we have castles and armour, and when gunpowder comes along, it makes them obsolete. So we kind of get this transition from an idea that she thinks the Middle Ages is knights and barons and dirty peasants. And that's pretty much her idea of the Middle Ages. And that's all it is. And it transitions into something else. So there's an enormous number of misconceptions embedded in this mode of transmitting information. And then we might want to think about how this extreme, the traditional extreme, is actually making a big comeback at the moment. So that idea of passing on a fixed body of knowledge and that knowledge being treated unproblematically comes up again and again and again now. So this is what I would call cultural inheritance model Mark II, or the knowledge-led cognitive memory recall curriculum, possibly with dual coding. And if you have a look on the left-hand side, this is a real knowledge organizer set of definitions that I've taken from a school, and I've just reproduced it anonymously here. And again, if we have, this is two knowledge organizers I've combined from two different schools, and you can see all the same kinds of problems appearing here. So once we start to say these are the key things students must know, we must transmit these, and here they are defined, and you can see all the same problems appearing. So if we look at the two definitions that I picked for medieval here, medieval definition number one, the period between 1066 and 1500. Well, that's a problem straight away because, well, where? In England. So again, we've got this idea that it suddenly starts in 1066 and suddenly stops in 1500, and there's no kind of fluidity or debate around what is the Middle Ages here at all. So we kind of simplify to the point of banality the past. Medieval, I love this one. Medieval refers to the Middle Ages. There we go, problem solved. Feudal system, the social structure of medieval England. Oh, so many problems with this. Social structure of medieval England. Number one, it probably wasn't. There's a massive debate around that. Of course, lots of people said that in the past. But there's been amazing work done by historians looking at, well, actually what we have in England is probably closer to what we might term a manorial system. And then even just this basic point, what's a social structure if you're year 7 reading this? What does that look like? There's nothing here that really helps you with that. There's a whole range of problems there. It also implies there's this kind of feudal economy set up, whereas actually, again, the feudal economy was very different in England to maybe what we might think of in Europe. Villein, peasants at the bottom of the feudal system. Again, all sorts of misconceptions in here. Villeins aren't always at the bottom, actually. Quite often freemen who didn't have an awful lot of land were much worse off than villeins who held reasonable roles within a manorial system, for example. So again, there's misconceptions, there's misunderstanding straight away here about the way things work. Peasant, a poor smallholder of low status. Again, no. Sometimes, often, but not always. Motte and Bailey, the first castle created by William. So, yes, maybe, okay, you can either style of castle, it's not the first castle, so there are all kinds of wording problems in here. I'm not going to go into that one in too much more. But we get a whole range of things, and then we get odd things. So, trebuchet. Okay, yeah, it might be nice for them to know that. Is that really so important for them to know? Possibly. Anyway, so the whole idea of transmitting knowledge and what knowledge we're transmitting and what understanding or lack of understanding we're transmitting is crucial here. So I think we've touched on lots of these issues as we've gone through. What are the problems with extreme one? Well, it's the knowledge of the powerful rather than powerful knowledge. So it's the knowledge that people who have created these curricula want to transmit across, and quite often that has political purposes to create a particular image of England or Britain or our history, and it ignored lots of things that challenge that. And although I would argue in most schools we're not trying to do that, sometimes we inadvertently do it by just picking up on the things that we know rather than questioning what we think we should be teaching. Being able to recall something doesn't necessarily mean they can see the bigger connections. So as we saw with those knowledge organisers, you might learn the definitions, but it doesn't mean you understand that in any kind of context. And in fact, it might hamper your ability to understand if you've been taught it badly or given a poor definition. Large aspects of child psychology and motivation are really ignored. I think what's really interesting, if you read recent works on cognitive load and cognitive science by people like Paul Kirshner and Sweller, then they talk much more now about student motivation, whereas actually in their early stuff they didn't really talk about that at all. So large aspects of child psychology are ignored. It can become a pub quiz, and actually just learning a load of stuff isn't actually that interesting. With the best will in the world, it's not that interesting unless you've already got an inherent interest in it. So how do we motivate students to learn? How do we start from their starting points? None of that's really considered in this kind of very extreme traditional model. And as we've seen already, that idea of truth is really oversimplified. So we get it doesn't matter whether things are true or not if they're cultural capital. And I want to give an example of that. King Arthur is a really good example here. The idea that people should learn the legend of King Arthur is pretty well embedded in most history curricula prior to the 1960s. And King Arthur appears as one of the early kind of foundational myths of Britain, but as kind of history. And it's not history. He doesn't exist. So and it's not, why do we tell ourselves stories about King Arthur? It's King Arthur as the origin of British royalty and royal power and the idea of a united England or Britannia or whatever. So King Arthur appears there as an unproblematic thing. And actually, I've been to schools that still teach King Arthur. I've been to private and independent schools that still teach King Arthur as a foundation part of British history, which is bonkers. And it's the same as Washington's cherry tree, I suppose, in the US. That idea that everybody learns about Washington chopping down the cherry tree of his father's cherry tree, and his father asking, "Who chopped down my cherry tree?" and Washington saying, "It was me, sir, I can't tell a lie," and getting in a lot of trouble. It never happened, but it's an important foundation myth in America, so people learn it about the goodness of Washington. Now, there is a really interesting question with that one about why do we tell ourselves stories about Washington and the cherry tree, but that's not how it's approached. It's approached as fact. And I quite like this from Hurst and Peters. Typically, the authoritarian, this is what they mean by the traditional teacher. The authoritarian teacher thought his job was to equip children with essential skills as reading, writing, and arithmetic to fill their heads with necessary information and to mould their characters into a desirable shape. Children were regarded rather like wayward adults. Methods were used which emphasised formal instruction and learning by heart. And that's what we kind of see in that traditional curriculum. Lots of formal learning, lots of rote learning. It was about improving character through these great stories, Arthur, Washington, and the cherry tree, and also imbuing them with the cultural capital, the cultural knowledge to enable them to be successful in society moving forwards. Okay. So hopefully that's given you some idea of this traditional mode of thinking about curriculum and the way in which people traditionally have answered those big curriculum questions that I brought up at the beginning. Next session, therefore, we're going to go on and think about the progressive response to that and how they responded to what Hurst and Peters called the authoritarian model of curriculum, and what I'm terming here as the very traditional model of curriculum. And then we'll go on and think about where other responses to that as well. I hope this has been useful. I hope it's been enjoyable. As I say, there are some issues. There are some materials that are attached to this if you want to have a look at them, and if you have a look on the next minute or so, there's some bibliography here for you to have a look at too.